Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change and lots to cover, little time. And I wanted to start off with a comment. Where is this comment? I actually had two comments I wanted to read. Actually, no. One comment. This is from Void. Void is yin yang, 2 times. 50% of physics research is for the military. 50% of taxes is for the military. In the private sector, just a handful of petrochemical corporations make most of the global warming emissions. Industrial civilization is not based on saving the environment because pollution is an externality and so is not calculated. On the contrary, big oil gets huge subsidies and the military is the largest polluter on the planet. And the military just lost, quote unquote, $21 trillion beyond their normal budget. Clearly, the priority of science is not ecology. Odom, author of the first ecology textbook, had to make a big fit just to get ecology as a discipline off the ground. His textbook was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission. The economics, it's a dismal science for a reason. Logarithmic math is wrong, and yet science is founded on symmetric logarithmic math, creating a logarithmic distribution of wealth as well. Peter Wadhams wants a techno-fix, but to store carbon at the necessary scale would require a complete reversal of what science has meant since its founding in the West. It's not part of the logarithmic math. Private profit, patent law, and technology controlled by the elite are built into the logarithmic mathematics with the same inverse exponential function. This is why Albert Bartlett, physics professor, gave the same lecture over 1,000 times. Population, arithmetic, and energy. Add it to your favorites playlist. Science is not going to fix this problem because the math is wrong. The math is wrong because the psychology of scientists are wrong. Key. This idea of containing infinite time as a geometric point. It has destroyed ecology on Earth. Wadhams can wax nostalgic about carbon fixing or geoengineering. Meanwhile, in the real world, science is used to destroy the planet. Those nuclear subs that he wrote on to do his Arctic research, do you really think they are interested in carbon sequestration? Nuclear power plants routinely leak deadly radiation, and depleted uranium is destroying the planet. ELF communication signals launch one-way first strike signals to nuclear subs. Thank you, Void, for that comment. Hope you all enjoyed that. Reading Void's commentary is like reading a Noam Chomsky essay. It's just very dense. There's a lot of information there, but it's all very good information when you dig in and you read. Moving on, something else that Void sent me was this article. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is from Faster Than Expected. I'm going to read a couple things from this blog, Faster Than Expected. All you need to do is Google it if you're wondering how to find it. An ocean heat wave just drove temperatures off Maine to near record highs. August 31st, sea surface temperatures in the vast Gulf of Maine hit a near record high of 68.93 degrees Fahrenheit. That is friggin' warm. On August 8th, part of what scientists called a month-long marine heat wave in the normally chilly waters that are home to everything from lobsters to whales. In some parts of the Gulf, surface temperatures soared to nearly 11 degrees warmer than normal. Using satellite data, scientists at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute said that over the past 30 years, the waters there have warmed at a rate more than 3 times the global average. Over the past 15 years, it has warmed at 7 times that average. We've set 10 daily temperature records this summer after setting 18 this winter. Andrew Pershing, chief scientific officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, said, adding that the Institute has had to add new colors to our temperature illustrations to reflect just how warm the Gulf of Maine has been this year. Concerns about marine heat waves have been rising in recent years in the wake of the widespread bleaching and death of corals caused by similar events in the globe's tropical belt. And this just comes on the heels of record temperatures in the Pacific, record temperatures in the Arctic, record temperatures in the Northern Atlantic, obviously. I'm going to read one more little snippet from Faster Than Expected. Greenhouse emissions from Siberian rivers peak as permafrost thaws. This is from September 4th. As permafrost degrades, previously frozen carbon can end up in streams and rivers where it will be processed and emitted as greenhouse gases from the water surface directly into the atmosphere. Quantifying these river greenhouse gas emissions is particularly important in Western Siberia, an area that stores vast amounts of permafrost carbon and is a home to the Arctic's largest watershed, the Ob River. Now, researchers from Umeå University and collaborators from the SLU, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom have shown that river greenhouse gas emissions peak in the areas where Western Siberian permafrost has been actively degrading and decrease in areas where the climate is colder. And permafrost has not started to thaw yet. The research team has also found out that greenhouse gas emissions from rivers exceed the amount of carbon that rivers transport to the Arctic Ocean. This was an unexpected find, as it means that Western Siberian rivers actively process and release large part of the carbon they receive from degrading permafrost, and that the magnitude of these emissions might increase as climate continues to warm, said Svetlana Sarakova, doctoral student at the Department of Ecology and Environmental Services at the Umeå University and one of the researchers in the team. Moving on to this article, What If It's Already Too Late? Being an Activist in the Anthropocene. This is from John Halstead. Is from, well, 5 days ago, I guess, or 6 days ago. The article starts out with, "We're fucked. Now what?" From John Halstead. What if it's already too late? I had a terrible thought recently. What if it's already too late? Actually, this idea has been haunting me, hovering on the boundary between my conscious and unconscious mind for some time. In 2016, Bill McKibben, founder of the climate activist organization 350.org, came to speak at a rally at the BP tar sands refinery in my backyard in the highly industrialized northwest corner of Indiana. The occasion was a series of coordinated direct actions around the world against the fossil fuel industry, collectively hailed as the largest direct action in the history of the environmental movement. What struck me about McKibben's speech, though, was its tone of, well, hopelessness. Here's how he concluded his 10-minute speech. I wish that I could guarantee you that we're all going to win in the end, the whole thing, and I can't because we don't know. The physics of climate change is pretty daunting at this point. The momentum of it is pretty big. We're not going to win everything. We're not going to stop global climate change. It's too late for that. But the work you're doing literally couldn't be more important. There's not many people who get to say in their lives, I'm doing the most important thing I could be doing. But that's what you guys are doing today. I can't guarantee you're going to win, but I can guarantee you in every corner of the world that we're going to fight. And that's going to be enough for now. Just knowing that we are taking it on. That's pretty sobering material for a speech at an environmental activist rally, not to mention a speech by one of the leaders of the climate movement. And I'm going to actually inject here that I'm hearing this more and more in the articles I read it. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the articles state that we're not going to stop a lot of what's already happening. that we're just in the phase of mitigating the worst of the consequences. We're basically locked into many of the consequences already. That's just where we're at. So, you know, move on to the doomer side of the abacus or whatever you're using. We're not going to stop global climate change. It's too late for that. At the time, I was caught up in the enthusiasm of participating in my first act of civil disobedience, so I didn't think much about McKibben's words, but they kept coming back to me. What did he just say? I remembered McKibben's words later as I was watching Aaron Sorkin's HBO TV series, The Newsroom. In one scene, a high-ranking scientist in the EPA is being interviewed by the show's lead, a news anchor played by Jeff Daniels. The scientist explains that the latest measurements of atmospheric CO2 had passed the point of 400 parts per million and what this means for humans. EPA scientists, the last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. Two things you should know. Half the world's population lives within 120 miles of an ocean. News anchor. And the other? EPA. Humans can't breathe underwater. The anchor then asked the scientist what his prognosis for humanity is. 1,000 years, 2,000 years. The scientist's response was bone-chilling. The scientist's response was bone-chilling. A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet. After a pause to get his bearings, the anchor resumes. So you're saying the situation is dire. EPA scientist, not exactly. Your house is burning to the ground. The situation is dire. Your house has already burned to the ground. The situation is over. So what can we do to reverse this? EPA, well, there's a lot we could do. Good, says the news anchor. EPA, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but now, no. News anchor, can you make an analogy that might help us understand? EPA, sure. It's as if you're sitting in a car in your garage with the engine running and the door closed and you've slipped into unconsciousness, and that's it. News, what if someone comes and opens the door? EPA, you're already dead. News, what if the person gets there in time? EPA, then you'd be saved. Okay, news anchor, so now what's the CO2 equivalent of getting there on time? EPA, shutting off the car 20 years ago. News, you sound like you're saying it's hopeless. EPA, yeah. The first time I saw this, I felt a flood of conflicting emotions, a combination of sinking horror and an absurd desire to laugh. I recognize it now as gallows humor. Now, this was a television show, but it's not fiction. In the real world, we passed 400 parts per million not long after the episode aired. And the fatalism of Sorkin's EPA scientist makes sense when we understand what 400 ppm really means. And you all know this is from, this is a large part, or was a large part of Guy McPherson's presentations. Now this is, remember Bill McKibben's organization 350.org? It takes its name from the research of James Hansen, the scientist who drew the public's attention to climate change when he testified before Congress in 1988. In 2007, Hansen told the world that 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is the safe upper limit to avoid a climate tipping point. But we passed that point in 1988, 30 years ago. At the time of my writing this, we have already seen CO2 levels as high as 412 parts per million. And we're already feeling the effects. As of 2015, the planet is warmer than it has ever been in the last 11,000 years. No wonder McKibben was fatalistic when I heard him speak in 2016. When he organized 350.org in 2007, it was already two decades after we had passed the safe threshold. Now we're in our third decade, and CO2 level had only continued to rise with no sign of abating. More carbon has been released into the atmosphere since Hansen's 1988 congressional testimony than has been released in the entire history of civilization before that. The end of the human race will be that it will eventually die of civilization. That's a quote from Emerson. Back on the TV show, the Jeff Daniels character asked the scientist to explain what all this would look like. EPA scientist, well, mass migrations, food and water shortages, spread of deadly disease, endless wildfires, way too many to keep under control, storms that have the power to level cities, blacken out the sky, and create permanent darkness. In this hopes that this was hyperbole, I started researching. I think he meant in the hope that this was hyperbole. The math is right on, and according to a Mother Jones article which fact-checked the script, the predictions are pretty reasonable. Even the part about blackening out the sky might come true if the geoengineers have their way and start sending sulfur into the atmosphere, Matrix-like, in the hopes of reducing global warming. In 2014, just as I was starting to wake up to climate change, the New York Times reported that a large body of research indicates that it is inevitable that the planetary temperature will rise by 2 degrees Celsius, and that we are locked into a future of drought, food and water shortages, and rising sea levels. And that's the optimistic estimate. In fact, we're on track for more than 4 C of warming. That's the temperature difference between the last ice age and the world now. So it's reasonable to expect the world of the near future to be as different from today as today is from the ice age. According to the Times, that kind of change might render the planet uninhabitable to human beings. Reports like this have become part of our daily news diet. It's shocking that they don't trigger a revolution. But as Steven Yeun's character says in the recently released movie, Sorry to Bother You, when people see a problem that they don't know how to solve, their response is to get used to it. Archdruid John Michael Greer, author of The Dark Age America, agrees with Sorkin's prognosis. From Greer's vantage point, this bleak prediction is only notable for what it leaves out: expanding war and ethnic conflict, increasingly frequent environmental disasters, a return to subsistence economy even in the first world countries, the collapse of governmental institutions, the rise of charismatic authoritarian strongmen, and drastically declining human population. Anywhere from a 70% reduction from 7.5 billion to 2 billion, which would bring the population to a sustainable level to complete human extinction. Does this sound like science fiction? If it does, it's not surprising, since these themes are increasingly common in our entertainment. There's the food shortages, the police state, and the walled-off cities depicted in USA's colony, minus the aliens. There's the government-endorsed religious fundamentalism and aggressive sexual politics in Hulu's The Handmaid's Tale. There's the crop failures, resource depletion, and declining population in the movie Interstellar. There's the collapse of governments, the rise of walled-off corporate states, and the sprawling climate refugee encampments in the sci-fi series Incorporated. More on that later. And let's not forget the rise of feudal warlords like Negan, the villain in AMC's The Walking Dead, which became bigger than Monday Night Football. Each and every one of these fictional scenarios is likely to be part of humanity's reality in the not-so-distant future. The decline has already begun. Its effects can be seen everywhere, but we barely notice it because the change is usually incremental rather than sudden. If we step back a minute from the daily barrage of news, we can see it. Superstorms like the 3 that struck the Atlantic in 2017, Harvey, Maria, and Irma, are becoming more common. We have already or will very soon reach the point of peak oil, after which the extraction of oil will enter a terminal decline, which will lead to more and more desperate and destructive attempts to extract the last drop. Most of our topsoil is already gone. Large parts of the U.S. are getting hotter and or wetter. There are record wildfires and droughts in the western U.S., not to mention in Syria, where the drought led to catastrophic civil war. Clean water is being privatized. Tens of thousands of people are denied access to water in cities like Philadelphia and Detroit. The American dream of rising affluence has disappeared for those who ever had access to it, as millions of people have lost jobs with benefits and been forced into effective corporate slavery or precarious employment with no health care or social security. Not coincidentally, we have recently witnessed the rise of the surveillance state, the militarization of domestic police forces, the popular legitimation of the alt-right, and not to mention the election of the demagogue would-be dictator as president of the country that holds itself out to the world as the bastion of democracy, and he's building a literal wall. This was the stuff of science fiction not too long ago. Today, it's our reality and our entertainment. While shows like The Handmaid's Tale and Colony have the potential to numb us to our present reality, sometimes science fiction can help us to see our present more clearly. Watching one of these shows not too long ago, I had another terrible thought. What if none of this is an accident? Everything is going according to plan. Everything is going according to plan. I don't know whose plan it is, and I think that it's a really stupid plan, but everything is going according to it anyways. Dmitry Orlov. I had recently thought racism was a glitch in America's social system, something that can be overcome with time and education. Recently, however, I've begun to see how racism is actually a function of a capitalist system. It keeps the poor and working class divided along race lines to the benefit of the rich. As Malcolm X succinctly put it, you can't have capitalism without racism. What if, like racism, biosphere wrecking climate change is not an accidental byproduct of our capitalist system? What if it isn't a bug, but a feature? What if the system isn't broken, as progressives claim? What if the system is functioning exactly as it's supposed to? There was another television show that got me thinking about this, a series called Incorporated, which premiered on Sci-Fi in 2016. The premise of the show was that the world governments had gone bankrupt and had been effectively replaced by large corporations. These corporations functioned in walled-off cities called green zones, outside of which was a sea of displaced people living in red zones, which included refugee camps overflowing with people having fled coastal cities flooded due to climate change. In the show, there was virtually no mobility between the residents of the green zone, the corporate class, and the residents of the red zone, the unincorporated. There are no checks on the corporations other than the threat of violence from other corporations. Although they live very privileged lives by comparison, those living within the corporate walls are virtual slaves to the corporation. As I watched this, I was struck by two thoughts. The first was the close similarity between Incorporated's dystopic future and our present reality. The second thought was, what if this is the goal? What if this is the desired outcome for some of the corporate class? Zero government regulation. Anything can be bought for a price. Extremely exclusive social status. Technological wonders for the few who can afford them. In short, what if everything is going according to plan? It doesn't require believing in a conspiracy to see that our capitalist system is driving us toward the future depicted in our Incorporated, but that isn't by accident. For it to function, capitalism depends on growth. Without growth, the incentive for capital investment disappears and the system breaks down. In an ideal capitalist system, there are no limits to growth. In order to grow without limit, capitalism needs two things: unlimited demand and unlimited supply. On the demand side, this means conspicuous consumption, socially manufactured needs, and disposable goods. On the supply side, this means access to cheap and abundant energy, i.e. fossil fuels. Without these conditions, the system cannot produce the kinds of surpluses which motivate the capital investment that perpetuates the system. But these conditions, unchecked consumption and the burning of fossil fuels, inevitably lead to disasters, both economic and environmental. It turns out that's part of the system too. In The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, 2007, Naomi Klein describes how the corporate class has learned to profit from natural and economic disasters by pushing through policies of deregulation and privatization, while the impacted citizenry is too distracted and disorganized by the disaster to notice. Examples include Hurricane Katrina, the Gulf War, and 9/11, to name just a few of the many. The corporate class benefits from these policies while the rest of the population is left with collapsing public infrastructure, declining incomes, and increasing unemployment. I'm going to just stop and inject here. It just dawned on me, if everything is going according to plan, it lends a lot of credence to the conspiracy theorists. Many of their the view is that all of this is by design and all of this is designed to enslave us. And on some levels, it's very true. An economic system that requires constant growth while bucking almost all serious attempts at environmental regulation generates a steady stream of disasters all on its own, whether military, ecological, or financial. The appetite for easy short-term profits offered by purely speculative investment has turned the stock currency and real estate markets into crisis-creating machines. Our common addition to dirty, non-renewable energy sources keeps other kinds of emergencies coming, natural disasters, and wars waged over scarce resources, which in turn create terrorist blowback. Given the boiling temperatures, both climatic and political, future disasters need not be cooked up in dark conspiracies, all indications that simply by staying the current course, they will keep coming with ever more ferocious intensity. Disaster generation can therefore be left to the market's invisible hand. While the disaster capitalism complex does not deliberately scheme to create the cataclysms on which it feeds, though Iraq may be a notable exception, there is plenty of evidence that its component industries work very hard indeed to make sure the current disastrous trends continue unchallenged. That's from the shock doctrine. According to Klein, this leads to an increasingly divided world. Whether it is post-Gulf War Iraq or post-Katrina New Orleans, everything is divided between green zones and red zones, stark partitions between the privileged and the precariat. In the red zones, infrastructure is left to decay and social services are stripped of resources, while the privileged withdraw to the gated green zones, which are protected by the police and military. In many places, this is the present day reality, and it's not so far removed from the future depicted in Incorporated. We're fucked. There's no reason for amazement. Surely one always knew that cultures decay and life's end is death. That's from Robinson Jeffers, the Persine, or Persien, or something like that. Of course, the world of Incorporated isn't the end of the story either. It's just a chapter in the story of civilizational decline, and we know how that story ends: death. Our civilization is going to die. If you're like me, you need to sit with this last sentence for a while. Of course, there's plenty of people out there saying otherwise. I could pick different sources to believe. With the World Wide Web at our fingertips, it's quite easy nowadays to choose the answers you like. I could choose more comforting answers. Boom, 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 boom. But it was a question, not an answer, that really devastated me. Radical environmentalist Derek Jensen asked this question of his audiences, and it's one which I think every environmental activist should ask themselves. Do you think this culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of life? That question is what convinced me that the world as we know it is going to end sooner rather than later. And more experts are coming to the same conclusion, like Brad Warner, a pink-haired complex systems researcher who in 2012 presented a provocatively titled paper to thousands of scientists at the meeting of the American Geophysical Union titled, "Is Earth Fucked?" Warner's answer, more or less. Or like Daniel Kahneman, the cognitive psychologist who won a Nobel Prize for his studies of how irrationally humans respond to problems which require immediate personal sacrifices now to avoid uncertain collective losses. When asked to assess humanity's chances for survival, Kahneman responded, "This is not what you might want to hear. I am very sorry, but I am deeply pessimistic. I really see no path to success on climate change." Or like Meyer Hillman, a social scientist and senior fellow emeritus of the Policy Studies Institute, who has spent the last 20 years writing and speaking about the climate change policy, and who in 2017 announced his withdrawal from speaking and writing on climate change, declaring, "We're doomed." Hillman raised the question as Jensen, the same question as Jensen. Do we really think human beings will move to zero global emissions in the near future? More specifically, Hillman asks, can you see everyone in democracy volunteering to give up flying? Can you see the majority of the population becoming vegan? Can you see the majority agreeing to restrict the size of their families? Hillman can't, Jensen can't, and I can't either. That's the point that is glossed by so many evangelists of the renewable energy. Renewable energy can't replace fossil fuels. About 250 years ago, human beings started using fossil fuels, first coal, then oil, to power civilization, but what followed was unprecedented explosion of growth. The civilizational progress, which we take for granted, is a result of burning of fossil fuels, but the fossil fuels are a finite resource, and when they are gone, that will be the end of growth and progress too. Renewable energy sources cannot produce as much energy as fossil fuels, and transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy only address the supply side of the equation. A renewable energy economy would only work if we simultaneously reduced our consumption. I'm not talking about people taking shorter showers and turning off the lights when they leave the room. I'm talking about a contraction of the economy, which would crash the global capitalist system. We simply can't transition to a 100% renewable energy economy without also ending capitalism. Nothing short of a global socialist revolution is going to be enough, and I'm using revolution quite literally here. But capitalism has proven so adept at adapting to challenges and absorbing dissent. Nothing short of the end of the world is likely to bring it about. Someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So we can now revise that and witness the attempt to imagine capitalism by way of imagining the end of the world. This is from Frederick Jameson, Future City. While it's easy for most people in developed countries to look around and think that all is well, the fact is we are living in what Roy Scranton calls the gap between sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind. We are like the patient who goes to the doctor for a routine checkup. They feel fine, but the doctor returns looking grim. The prognosis is terminal. For some, this might actually be welcome news. I have communist friends who have been waiting for a long time for the collapse of capitalism, and I have anarchist friends for whom the collapse of civilization is good tidings of great joy. Everything is going according to plan, indeed. There's even some people who are trying to accelerate the collapse by undermining any attempt to reform capitalism which might prolong its demise. It turns out that the Marxists are partially right. Capitalism is going to collapse, but it won't require the revolution of the working class. It's going to happen through the natural process of capitalism doing what capitalism does, consuming forests, species, and human potential, and excreting carbon dioxide, toxic chemicals, and radioactive waste. In short, eating everything in sight, shitting where it eats. Even if climate change were not a reality, our civilization would still die. Capitalism is just not sustainable. The combination of overconsumption, only partially the result of overpopulation, and overpollution will lead inevitably to civilizational collapse. Considering the damage capitalism is doing to the planet, that might not be such a bad thing, but unfortunately, our civilization is going to take a good part of the biosphere down with it. And the stages of grieving for a civilization. There's a cartoon here. 5 stages of climate grief. 1, denial, nothing to see here, move along. 2, anger. You fucking flat earth fucks. Number 3, bargaining. I know, let's start over. 4, depression. Oh no, it's all gone so horribly wrong. 5, acceptance. Methane? When you become a parent, one thing becomes really clear, and that is that you want to make sure your children feel safe, and it rules out telling a 10-year-old that the world's ending. Ooh, this is from Interstellar, the film Interstellar. When my son was 13, he went through an existential crisis. He was losing his faith in religion, in the religion he had been raised in, including the belief in an afterlife. The thought of personal extinction terrified him. Over the next several years, he made peace with his own mortality. He did so, at least in part, by taking refuge in a new faith, the faith in human progress. He could accept the fact that he will die one day, but at least the accumulated knowledge of humanity would survive. I felt the same way, and I know many atheists and religious naturalists who do as well. We accept our own mortality while we cling to faith in the immortality of civilization. But I don't believe that anymore, and I don't know what to say to my son. It turns out it's not just individuals who die, so do civilizations. As Archdruid John Michael Greer explains in Dark Age America, the last 5,000 years of human history have not been a straight line. There have been many dark ages. Europe in the early Middle Ages is only the most recent example in the West. There was also the collapse of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilization in the Bronze Age. There were 3 separate Egyptian Dark Ages, and there have been others in both the West and the East. The causes of these prior dark ages are familiar: climate change, population growth, soil degradation, and widening social inequality. Many clever men like you have trusted to civilization, many clever Babylonians, many clever Egyptians, many clever men at the end of Rome. Can you tell me, in a world that is flagrant with failures of civilization, what there is particularly immortal about yours? That's from G.K. Chesterton, the Napoleon of Notting Hill. I didn't realize this article was so long, but it is so good, so I'm going to read it to the end. Our present situation is unique, however. Those civilizations before us exceeding the carrying capacity of their land bases. But we are connected to a global economy. We are facing collapse not just on a regional level, but on a planetary level. And while civilizational decline is not uncommon, the speed at which we are rushing toward ours is. The reason why we are so rapidly rushing towards this end is because we have a terminal case of denial. In The Denial of Death, 1974, Ernest Becker theorizes that the basic motivation for human behavior is the desire, in fact, the need to deny the reality of our own deaths. According to Becker, we engage in immortality projects in an attempt to create something that will transcend death. But these immortality projects are maladaptive because they sever us from the flow of life, of which death is a part. We do this on an individual level, but also on a collective level. Western civilization itself can be understood as a collective immortality project, one giant, complex attempt to deny our connection to nature, to the goddess, and hence to deny our mortality. Climate change denial is just a special case of a much broader and deeper denial, a denial of our limits. And it's not just climate change deniers who are in denial. Many activists on the other side of the spectrum, like me, are in denial as well. I wasn't denying that climate change is happening, but I was denying what it meant. I believe that we will win, I chanted along with my fellow activists. I was in denial, and the origin of that denial, a faith in human progress, is what got us into this mess. Looking back, a lot of my environmental activism looks like the stages of grief, denial, anger, and bargaining. I moved into the depression phase recently. The good thing about the depression is that it allows me to recognize this process for what it is. I am grieving for the death of human civilization. The last stage of grief, I am told, is acceptance. But what does that look like? Do we go on protesting? Do we go on fighting, like Bill McKibben says, because fighting is better than doing nothing? To be continued tomorrow in Die Early and Often, being Addis in the Anthropocene. I don't think I read that, so that's good. Maybe I'll read that tomorrow. Great article and lots to discuss in there. Of course, we are, yeah, we're not the only civilization to collapse. And it's interesting to me when I hear about people, when I hear people talking about our current, situation as humans, as far as, whatever it might be, the problems that we have, climate change or Donald Trump or racism or sexism or poverty, income inequality, on and on, all the problems that are, police brutality. We're just, it's interesting the way that people talk about all the problems as if they are new or I don't want this to sound weird, but as if they're special, as if they're, pertinent to only our civilization. But I mean, civilizations have done the same things we are doing long before us, and many different civilizations have done those things. Many different civilizations have been racist or had owned slaves or beat their women or I'm not saying that that's just humans, that's just what we do. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying it's not unique to us. It is humans who do this kind of stuff, and humans have always done this kind of stuff. We're just probably in a civilization that is finally, possibly, maybe closer to stopping doing all that stuff. I guess that part is unique. But as all civilizations do, we're not gonna overcome our humanness. We're not gonna overcome our inability to squash our, whatever it is, the lizard brain, the survival, the competitive, the abusive, whatever part of us that continues that cycle for us. We just can't seem to get past that. And I wish we could, because if we could get past that, we might actually get past climate change. But all of that is moot at this point, because we don't have time. We just don't have time. That's all I have time for tonight. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.